Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Jessica Murray, Sierra Club Canada's Ontario Director. Today I am speaking with Aric McBay, a longtime activist, organic farmer, and author of Full Spectrum Resistance, which includes 2 volumes. The first was about building movements and fighting to win, and Volume 2 was about actions and strategies for change. Having read both books, my identity and beliefs about activism have been reshaped by the many stories that Aric has devoted his time to sharing with us. It is a great gift to know more fully the stories we all know so well, whether it's Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, or the Wet'suwet'en fight to protect their lands from the destruction of pipelines. Aric will be joining me in Toronto this June 2024 in a 2-day teach-in aptly named Full Spectrum Resistance, where we invite activists from all walks of life to take that grounding breath together, to upgrade our knowledge on activist strategy, as well as build community through radical imagination, play, and spontaneity. Before we begin, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you can get the latest episodes from us. I hope you'll enjoy this conversation with Aric McBay. Hello and welcome to Aric McBay. We are here. Welcome to Sierra Club Canada's podcast, The Environment in Canada. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. I'm really looking forward to diving into content in regards to your book. We are making good progress into organizing for a teach-in June 2024. So very excited to pick your brain and hear about your thoughts as we build everything out. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure as well. So to start off, let's do some introductions. Who are you? Where are you?
Great. So my name's Aric McBay. I'm an author and an organizer and an organic farmer. And so as an author, I write mostly nonfiction about social movements and social movement strategy, along with kind of climate fiction. So looking at both the impacts of climate change and also how we can kind of build more equitable societies that are also ecological in the future. As an organizer, I work on many different campaigns. So particularly in the area of climate justice of late. So I do work around Indigenous solidarity, stopping pipelines, and also prisoner justice. And I work on a lot of different things because I see them all as very connected in fundamental ways. And I'm also an organic farmer. So I live on an island just east of Kingston on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. And we have an organic farm, my partner and I, where we grow food for, hundreds of people and where we also make habitat for different endangered species. I'm very excited at the time of recording because we've been trying to kind of cultivate this colony of purple martins on the farm, which is the largest swallow in our hemisphere, I think. And so we just had a group of them return from their kind of winter migration to Brazil, and it's very exciting.
That is super exciting.
Yeah.
Are they actually purple?
They're actually they're a very dark kind of iridescent purple color. So
Mm.
in French, they're called les hirondelles noires or black swallows because that's how dark their color is. But you can see the kind of gleam in the sunshine of the purple iridescent feathers.
Oh, that's so exciting. Well, congratulations. That's a big deal. Providing
Thanks.
homes
Yeah.
for endangered species. No big deal. Which island are you on? Are you on Wolf Island or?
We're on Howe Island, which is the
Okay.
slightly smaller of the two and less well known. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. That sounds very utopic. Is that the word? Utopia. I just like imagine it being beautiful and wonderful.
It can be. It is a very beautiful place. I can go out and see like so many different wild creatures. Like we have osprey nesting on an old wind turbine on the farm. And so I can go out and see a bunch of osprey like catching fish, or I can see all of these different kind of species that we've cultivated. It also has some, living on an island has its inconveniences as well, but it has lots of benefits, and I love being here.
It's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing more about your home. It's really nice to see that picture. Okay, I want to backtrack a bit because you said something that really resonated for me. Just the idea, and I find in the way that I practice organizing for activism as well, just this idea that all these different kinds of, quote unquote topics and how they're all interconnected and
Hmm.
how we can have many hands in it seems like it's many hands in different pots, but in my mind it's like just like all the same pot, really, just like maybe from a different
Hmm.
angle. So yeah, let's dive right into your work. There's so much
Excellent.
off the top of my mind. I think when I read your book, the thing that really stood out for me as somebody that practices engaged Buddhism, like really looks at the ways that we can transform violence in ourselves and also the world around us as kind of a starting point. I think what really struck me was that you kind of explained how corporations are this like sociopathic entity and that persuasion and maybe even like a gentle love isn't going to be the
Hmm.
thing that's going to stop it. So to me, that was quite a radical shift just for it to be impacting me on a personal level. Maybe you can speak a bit about all of that. Like, what do you think is happening to our movements as of late and what's missing and kind of what's needed, really?
Hmm.
Mm.
Great. So the book Full Spectrum Resistance is a book that I wrote because I thought we were losing. And so it's a book that was driven really by in a sense the failures of my own activism or the activism that I participated in for decades since I became an activist as a teenager, especially doing kind of environmental work where I grew up in Northern Ontario. And it became clear to me as I got older and became more experienced as an activist that almost every campaign that I was working on was losing. So,
Mm.
there were some examples of exceptions. They were like certain places that we were able to protect or certain species, certain struggles that we did win. But the big picture indicators were all moving in the wrong direction, right? Like climate change continues to get dramatically worse despite all of this effort. And I think we can look at so many indicators, right? At economic inequality that continues to grow, at global authoritarianism. There are all of these problems that I don't need to enumerate. I'm sure you and your listeners are well aware of these trends. And so I wrote Full Spectrum Resistance as a way to try to understand and articulate why that was happening. Why were we moving in that wrong direction? Is it because things were just hopeless? Was it because of like overall kind of structural limitations of humanity or of our culture or something like that? And so in order to understand how we could do better or how we could be more effective in the different movements that I was active in, I studied historical movements and I studied movements in other places and times. And what I learned is that there actually are really, really solid principles for effective movements. We sometimes look at history and think of it as kind of a line of automatic progress, which is something that Martin Luther King Jr. articulated in a way, right? He said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But King was an activist, and I think he understood that it didn't happen automatically. So one of the things I learned in my research and in my time as an activist was that, all of these fundamental rights that we have, like the right to vote if you're not a property owning man or the right to free speech, all of these things were actually won by social movements, not just handed down by those in power.
Mm.
And those movements used a bunch of different approaches that some of the movements that I was working in weren't. And so I think one of the big, and I'm going to speak especially to the environmental movement because that's, I think that's what a lot of Sierra Club members are involved in. And that's how I got started myself, is that the environmental movement was focused increasingly on individual action, especially kind of consumerism. And what I've seen from successful movements around the world and in the past is that it's collective action that's needed. And I think that the movement or the tendency toward individual action, like voting or like buying things, is in part driven by the very kind of consumerist capitalist society that we live in, right? That sees
Mhm.
us not as kind of moral agents trying to make the world a better place, but as units of consumption and production. And
Almost like
so
a tactic born out of capitalism.
it very much is. It does
Yeah.
very much feel like that. And in contrast, these movements like the movement for women's suffrage or the civil rights movement, they really were movements that required lots of people to work together to engage in collective action and collective struggle. And that's something that's still alive in many grassroots movements, in unions. Unions very much, I think, understand the importance and the necessity of collective struggle and solidarity. But I see that as a substantial weakness of kind of the environmental movement and the left in general is this focus on individual actions and reducing consumption. And that
Mhm.
doesn't mean that's bad, right? It doesn't I do think it's the right thing to fly less or maybe to recycle more or these other things or to eat less meat. But I live on an organic farm in a straw bale house that I built myself. Like I do all of the things that like a person can reasonably or maybe unreasonably be
Yeah.
expected to do to reduce their consumption. But what really matters is like how many factories and refineries are out there putting out greenhouse gases.
Hmm.
That's ultimately what's going to determine our future, not just my individual ability to reduce consumption.
Hmm.
Um, and then I think another big hurdle that we have to overcome is, and you've touched on this already, Jessica, is the idea of persuasion as kind of the be all and end all. And so many of the movements that I've worked in have assumed, okay, well, if we can have the right arguments, if we can like phrase our arguments in the right way or do our research the right way and present it, then we'll be able to win people over, whether those are kind of regular folks or people in power. We'll be able to convince them to make the right decisions. But that's not really how social change happens. Social change and political power, like it really is about power. Those in power have the ability to ignore good arguments because it keeps them in power and it keeps them profitable.
Hmm.
Um, and those of us who are in more kind of grassroots social change positions, we need to be able to build up political power and movement power, especially through collective action, if we're
Hmm.
going to make those in power change what they're doing.
Hmm.
I think those are a couple of the really critical examples. And, in full spectrum resistance, I quoted a couple of examples of people going way back, kind of coming to this understanding from different movements, because I think this is actually a problem that many movements go through as kind of a developmental stage, that they start with persuasion, and then when that doesn't work, they either kind of learn or they give up.
Mm.
And so this is something that the suffragists understood, but also people who were anti-slavery abolitionists in the United States in the mid to late 1800s. And so I want to quote to you from William Lord Garrison, the abolitionist publisher. And he said, quote, "There is not any instance recorded either in sacred or profane history in which the oppressors and enslavers of mankind, except in individual cases, have been induced by moral suasion to surrender their despotic power and let the oppressed go free. But in nearly every instance, from the time that Pharaoh and his host were drowned in the Red Sea down to the present day, they have persisted in their evil course until some sudden destruction came upon them, or they were compelled to surrender their ill-gotten power in some other manner." And that's 1840 that people are having like this same discussion about moral suasion. And on the opposite side, there was a slaveholder named James Hammond who is quite clear on the opposite respect. He said, quote, "If you distilled nectar from your lips and discoursed sweetest music, do you imagine you could prevail upon us to give up 1,000 millions of dollars in the value of our slaves and 1,000 millions of dollars more in the depreciation of our land?" So I think that those in power actually are often quite honest, and
Mhm.
and we can kind of listen that, they don't want to give up all this stuff they have.
Yeah,
Why should they listen?
yeah,
And so, as Lloyd Garrison kind of alluded to, we have to build up the political power to make change, and often that means making bad things more expensive to do than good things, right? And that's how strikes work. That's how all of these different tactics work.
yeah, I got you. And I think in that kernel is like there is an element of force in there, like not force. And I love in your book that you really delineate between violence and force, because I think that's really important, especially,
Hmm.
with our kind of, I don't want to call it an obsession. I mean, it's probably a good thing that we don't want to be violent, but it's like
Hmm.
the idea of force is so scary to people that are progressive
Hmm.
because we really don't want to be violent. Like we want peace,
Hmm.
we want that just society. And so where is it that we can reframe the concept of force or even the
Hmm.
concept? I think one of the ones that I struggled with in your book was this concept of being a militant, 'cause, like,
Hmm.
military just has like certain connotations that it's like already negative, whereas like the way
Hmm.
that you define militancy is kind of something different. Maybe you can kind of speak to that just actually for moments for our readers to really grasp that.
Yeah, and so kind of for discussion's sake, in the book, I make a distinction between militancy and moderacy, or so between militants and moderates, and this is in terms of tactics. And so moderates are people who basically try to make change through conversation or through dialogue. They're trying to build shared understanding. And militants are people who try to engage in direct struggle, disruption, conflict, people who confront injustice directly. And so kind of a classic distinction or a classic example of these poles would be the difference between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. So
Mhm.
we would maybe look at Malcolm X and say, here's someone who's really militant and he really believed in no compromise. He spoke in these combative terms. Whereas we would look at maybe Martin Luther King and say, oh, here's someone who's more conciliatory. Here's someone who's trying to build understanding, who's trying to like reach out to white people and to all of these different groups to help them understand. And I think it is important to make that distinction. And I think that both of those roles are actually really important because I think that without militant action, there's very little incentive for those in power to listen to moderate voices.
Mhm.
So I'll give you I'm going to give you an example. First, though, before we move on from Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, I want to mention that we look back at them in this kind of sanitized way now, and oh, I would have marched with Martin Luther King if I'd been there. But
Right.
both Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were considered quite militant and quite dangerous by a lot of white people at the time. So
Mhm.
it goes to show how kind of relative these distinctions can be as well. So here in Kingston, there was a statue for a long time of Sir John A. Macdonald. Used to live in Kingston, which was the one of the first capital of Canada before it was moved to Ottawa. And as you probably know, he was also one of the creators of the residential school system. He engaged in like mass starvation of Indigenous people in the prairies. He put down the Métis Rebellion and had Louis Riel executed. So a lot of Indigenous people and a lot of non-Indigenous people in Kingston felt that it was time to remove this statue of Sir John A, which was in a public park. And so Indigenous people for many years had made kind of polite requests to have that statue removed. And the city said, okay, well, we'll consider it. We're gonna maybe we can like update the wording on the plaque so it's not as objectionable anymore. And then in 2021, you may recall there was a series of discoveries of unmarked graves at different residential schools, former residential schools across Canada. And for a lot of Indigenous folks in the Kingston area, that was kind of the last straw when it came to that statue of MacDonald. And so they set up a sacred fire and kind of an encampment basically around that statue. And they said, we're not going to leave until the city takes this statue down. And and the city at first said, no, we're not going to do anything. We're not going to remove it. But after a campaign of really 10 days, which involved a huge amount of discussion and outreach and education, the city voted voluntarily at an emergency meeting to remove that statue.
Okay.
So all of a sudden they listened to these voices who for many years had been trying to do this polite work of education and outreach, trying to make, settlers understand why MacDonald was such a terrible figure to celebrate. And that happened in a sense because of a certain kind of militancy. So the
Mhm.
people who maybe organized that encampment, they might not describe themselves as militant, but in the
Sure.
kind of ways that I'm using it, they were people who were willing to confront injustice directly. They were people who were willing to engage in disruption and to create conflict, or not to create it, but to bring it to the surface, let's say,
Mhm.
to use conflict to then engage in discussion. So I really do see that those two approaches, that kind of moderate approach and that more militant approach, is actually really necessary to bring about change. Radical flanking is a related idea that, those in power are more likely to listen to those kind of moderate voices if there's someone who seems more unreasonable in comparison. That's certainly a dynamic that was at play with people like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And I think Martin Luther King was actually very conscious of that dynamic and tried to present himself as the reasonable person that, either you negotiate with us or you're going to have to deal with these, really militant, later kind of Black Power activists.
Mhm.
So I see that dynamic is really critical and intrinsic to the success of so many movements. And I actually think that it's something that people in Canada have more trouble with for a variety of reasons.
Mhm.
I think in the States, there's a much more, and in many other countries, there's a much stronger tradition of kind of like rowdy struggle. And I do think the political context in Canada in general is more polite, for better or for worse. And so a lot of people are concerned about keeping the peace, and being peaceful to them can be more important than like being fair or just. And I
Mhm.
see that as a problem. I think that peace is something that emerges from justice and fairness. And
Mhm.
sometimes bringing conflict to the surface actually helps us to address conflict and bring about the conditions of true long-term peace and equality.
And I think you're really hitting on the nail on the head of kind of something that I've been really digesting recently, where it's hard to work together sometimes, like, and I think even with the backdrop of, okay, this kind of diversity in where we sit on whether we're a moderate or a militant, when we disagree on like what the tactic should looks like or what we should be doing, it can be really painful to feel like you're on the
Mhm.
same side again. So
Mhm.
I've been really kind of looking, and in those moments, I've just been like, yeah, like the feelings come up, and then it's like,
Mhm.
okay, I'm going to process these, and then I'm going to
Mhm.
try to reach out again. Because
Mhm.
it's like, to me, there's like there's an importance of like refusing to let each other go when at the heart of it, like you want the same things, and that
Mhm.
there's like a feeling of like there's like hopefulness in there for me that like we can get through this, we can learn something new here, and it's going to help us. But it's also hard, and there's also a capacity, for whether people are able to even kind of hold that relationship. So I'm curious to know, like in this time of like high intersectionality, kind of like what are you seeing, or what could you share that might be helpful in those regards? Because just the number of times that I've seen a movement kind of dim or kind of even fall apart because people get a bad taste in their mouth and they're like, I needed to give up on this because it just drove me crazy.
Mhm.
So yeah, I'm curious to know if you have any ideas around that.
Yeah, plenty. And I think intersectionality is really critical. So one of the reasons that I called that book Full Spectrum Resistance is because I think that to win, movements need to bring kind of the full spectrum of their capacities to bear. And that
Mm,
includes not just a variety of different tactics, but lots of different people from different backgrounds. And I think that's morally good because I think that makes our groups and societies more interesting and better. But I also think it brings the necessary like networks and skills and perspectives that a movement needs to succeed, because having a broad range of ideas is actually really critical to developing good strategy. So in terms of building more intersectional movements, there are a number of things that I've learned over the years, sometimes the hard way, and some advice that I would share. And I think one bit of thinking that I think is really key is to have a continued respect for diversity in opinion and differences of opinion. So, a lot of groups that I work with are very participatory and often use consensus for their decision making, right? And
Mhm.
so consensus is great in a lot of ways, but it can also make us think we all have to agree about everything, which
Right.
we don't. I think that if we have more tolerance for difference,
Mhm.
then that actually allows us to work together on specific campaigns or specific actions better. So I don't think that we need to rush to the point of having, totally unified, kind of synthesizing all our different perspectives and all of our analysis. Like, I think that's a great goal. Like, I would love to have, the grand unified theory of liberation. In
Sure.
practice, that takes a long time, though. And I actually think it comes about through action and through like doing things together. I don't think you can ever get there just by sitting down and talking.
Mhm.
So for me, I think looking for actions that we can cooperate on, regardless of kind of our background or our causes, is really critical. So I just finished the manuscript for another book called Movements That Won. That's the working title anyway. And one of the things that I wanted to do in that book was to kind of highlight a bunch of stories of movements that were more intersectional in their approach and that succeeded because of that.
Mm.
Um, and so one of the poorly known, at least I think in Canada and the US, one of the poorly known examples that I talk about in that book is something called the Green Bands in Sydney, Australia. And I won't tell the whole story because there's not time, but in the 1970s, in the early 1970s in Sydney, Australia, there was this huge construction boom. There was like mass gentrification. I mean, rents were going up. It reminds me a lot of some of the economic factors that we face now. But a group of kind of radical construction workers in a radical construction union were able to work together with a bunch of different groups like suburban environmentalists and feminists and like indigenous activists and queer activists to block gentrification development projects and gentrification and like ecologically destructive development projects across Sydney. There were more than 40 different so-called green bands over a period of 3 years, which like saved parks, it saved like working class neighborhoods, heritage buildings, like all of these things, because they were able to identify this common tactic of like blocking construction essentially that people
Mhm.
from all of these different causes who had cared about all of these different issues could work on together. So, that tolerance for difference is important, but also like finding those common tactics where we can work together is really critical and I think allows us to build the relationships. Because I think, maybe that's the third thing is like the building relationships and bridge builders is that
Mhm.
it's nice to think like, oh, we just need to develop this kind of shared philosophy. But in the history of movements, that's very rarely how it starts. I think they're like people who are maybe more radical in their analysis and who can help build that approach, who can help like see, oh, actually like capitalism and patriarchy are just two sides of like unfair power or this sort of thing. But often it's about building those direct relationships with other people. A story that I recount in Full Spectrum Resistance and that I think about a lot is about the alliance between queer activists and striking miners during Margaret Thatcher's Britain. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Pride. I think it came out in 2014. It's like a dramatization of this story. But Margaret Thatcher was trying to destroy the coal miners' unions in the 1980s. And so all of these coal miners were on strike for months or even years. And so they were, getting hungry. Meanwhile, they were getting beat up by the police. And
Mhm.
then there was a group of young queer organizers in London who were also getting beat up by the police. And they saw, these striking miners being attacked by police on TV, and they're like, actually, maybe they're a lot like us. We have this common cause. And so they decided to start a group called Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners. And they like canvassed and built these relationships. They gathered money and supplies, and they went from London to these northern kind of mining towns and built these really profound relationships of genuine support. It wasn't out of self-interest. It was like out of a genuine, deep sense of solidarity. And in the end, the Labour Party helped decriminalize homosexuality in the UK. They brought about all of these legal changes in part because of these miners and miners' unions who were able to support that change.
Mm,
So I think that's a fascinating example of how bridge builders can not only make our movements nicer to be in, but
right.
actually bring like that collective power that's necessary for transformative change, especially over time.
What a beautiful example of solidarity. Because I think the word solidarity is used so frequently now in activism. It's almost like we forget what it really means. Like
Hmm.
sometimes when we're working kind of in a larger coalition, it's like we're heading in the same direction, but there isn't this like sometimes it's like lacking in that feeling, I think, of kind of like what you're
Hmm.
sharing through that story.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's true. And at the same time, I do think that genuine solidarity and genuine intersectionality is more important than ever because I
Yeah.
feel that there was maybe a time, to go back to that abolitionist example or something, maybe a few hundred years ago, these different struggles did feel more separate.
Yeah.
But for me, in our kind of more globalized society, especially, it really does feel like all of our struggles are kind of increasingly crammed together.
Hmm.
Climate justice is a big thing I work on, and that's in part because if we don't have a livable future and a livable climate, then all of our other movements are going to fail. But also to end the climate emergency or to solve the climate emergency, that means that indigenous people need to have control over their own land so that it's not just like colonial extraction companies that are using them up. It also means that we have to address capitalism and build other economic and political systems that aren't exploitative and extractive. I mean, I really do think that intersectionality is the key to our collective survival. So
Yeah.
it's not just, I mean, obviously I want to build a world which is feminist and queer and all these other wonderful things, but I think we also need to do that to survive as, as a species at this point.
Yeah, I love that. And I've been thinking along the same lines as well. It's like doing the quote unquote right thing is also what's going to feel good and also going to lead to the right results. So to me, it's
Yes.
all kind of like obvious. So sometimes definitely get kind of like, why is this so hard that we're not there yet?
It is hard, and I think it's because in part of the lack of examples, right? That it doesn't feel like there are a lot of examples of that in our pop culture or in the stories that people tell each other. I think so many of the stories that I've told in my work or that I've, researched, they're actually very obscure, or that the way they've been told, especially the civil rights movement, has
Mhm.
been vastly oversimplified. And I think so I write, these climate fiction, I write some speculative fiction books and novels. And one of the reasons that I do that is to help increase our kind of collective imagination about the kinds of societies it's possible to build and to live in. Because I do think that one of the things that our current kind of technological form of capitalism does is it monopolizes our attention and it shrinks our imagination. Kind of
Mm,
it kind of like feeds us the same ideas over and over so that we don't have space in our minds for new possibilities. And I
mhm.
really do think that's an explicit goal of things like Facebook, right? Because the metrics the algorithm uses to like quote unquote improve is just how much time people spend on different social media platforms. Like the
Mhm.
goal is to get attention because they think that will make them money. But attention, like sucking up all of our attention, is what they do. And that means telling us the stories that billionaires want us to hear and not the stories that are actually going to build more livable futures or build cultures of resistance that are nice to be part of.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that because I think I often also reflect on that. I'm like, I don't know if people realize like it literally could just be like that. Like just if we
Mhm.
changed our minds together, like what couldn't we do? You know what I mean? Like,
Hmm.
look at everything we've done. You know,
Hmm.
I think about kind of like the concept of deep ecology and how, you know, in the grand scheme of life's existence on the planet, if you put it on a 24-hour clock,
Hmm.
we're like just before midnight, it's like
Hmm.
that short.
Hmm.
So it's like, how could we like tell ourselves in such a small, narrow way that nothing else is possible except for this way? It's so silly to me almost.
Absolutely.
It would be more funny if it wasn't so serious. So it's like
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah,
funny, but
it's
also like,
true.
what? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the vast majority of human cultures across the world and throughout history have not been these like capitalist, imperialist,
Hmm.
ecologically destructive, unequal societies.
Hmm.
And I do think it's really important to see how fast things can change when people do change their minds or do work together. A lot of kind of nonviolent revolutions happened almost by surprise or social transformations. Like I remember I did a bunch of research into apartheid and writing about Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress. And I would read these books that were published like months before the end of apartheid. And they'd be like, yeah, well, it's probably going to go on for another 50 years. What can you
Hmm.
do?
Right.
And they didn't realize like how close that change actually was to coming. I think that that change is really possible when we build powerful movements and when we seize opportunities. There are so many different ways to participate, and I think that's another key to building not just intersectional movements, but movements that can use a variety of tactics.
Hmm.
Um, I think that in one of the things that holds our movements back is the idea that there's only one right tactic. There's
Hmm.
only one thing that we should all be doing. And,
Hmm.
maybe people who are more moderate say like, oh, the only one right thing is that we should like vote and sign petitions.
Hmm.
And then maybe people at the other end say like, no, that's you're being a sellout or whatever. There's usually some name calling involved. They're
Yeah.
like, oh, the only thing to do is like withdraw from capitalism. And I actually think that we need all kinds of tactics and all kinds of approaches. And because that's what the history of successful movements shows, right? Like if you look at fundamental rights or if you look at different kind of social or political transformations, all of these different tactics were being used at once by people from many different groups and many different movements potentially working together. And that's not just like the best way for people to get along in movements. It's the way to build the most impact in because it lets everyone participate fully at kind of the risk level that they choose and in the ways that they choose. So
So on a practical level, would that look like, everybody kind of agreeing on a goal or an objective and then being like, okay, well, based on that, we're going to take this tactic. And over here, we're going to take this tactic and just kind of working alongside each other that way. Is that kind of what it looks like in practice?
yeah, I think that's a big part of what it looks like in practice. And then I also think that it's important to have that support across kind of tactical lines or across the tactical spectrum. So I think one of the most important things that we can do to support people who are engaged more in like frontline struggle or direct struggle, if we're
Mhm.
not ourselves, is to support them in other ways by speaking in favor of that action to say like sure, that's not the tactic that I chose, but I respect that. And I think it's important. And I think they're doing something really critical. I mean,
Mhm.
there are so many people who are on the front lines of indigenous struggle who are already from they're not from wealthy economic backgrounds to start with. And
Yeah.
they have to like bear all of these burdens of not just centuries of colonialism, but also like having to pay for all that. It's really
Yeah.
expensive. And so I think one of the most important things that we can do to support indigenous struggles and all kinds of climate justice struggles is to make sure that we are speaking in favor of many different kinds of action and that we're contributing, in a material sense to people who are risking their safety or even risking their lives to help protect the planet and to help protect our collective future. Yeah.
Yeah. I actually had a conversation yesterday, and naturally, these sorts of conversations just tend to happen on casual conversations with people that don't really want to be having them.
Mhm.
He's like, oh yeah, I try not to think about this stuff too much. And so I'm kind of also like, okay, like that's interesting because that's also there, that people are feeling overwhelmed. And, I was speaking to a friend that spends so much time outdoors, just like alone, camping, like loves nature,
Mhm,
and can tell that he relies on it even for
mhm,
his well-being, right? But there's still this kind of like there's like some sort of block. I think I don't know if it's like it just gets and this is where I was suggesting, where it's like, well, when you actually take actions with people that are also worried about things, it actually alleviates that fear.
mhm.
It's not like I think that we're closer to getting there because I've decided to take action. It's just more like, I don't know, it just feels different. At least I'm doing something.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. That's my experience as well. I've been an activist for I don't know, at least 25 years now. And I used to feel a lot more anxious about it. And in some ways when I was doing less. And I think one of the reasons I feel less anxious is because I feel like I'm doing all that I can and that
Right.
I'm genuinely making an impact. And I
Mhm.
do think that action is kind of a critical cure for anxiety and despair. And that's
Mhm.
supported by all kinds of psychological research. One of the examples that I give is these kinds of phony emergencies that psychologists have created in various studies. So there are these kinds of experiments where they wanted to see how people would act in emergencies. And so they would put someone in a room and they'd of course give them some other thing like a quiz to fill out to distract them. And then they would start pumping smoke into that room. And most people, if they were alone, they would get up and they'd go out and they'd say to the experimenters, "Hey, the room's filling with smoke. Like,
What's going
I
on?
thought you should be aware of this." Yeah. And then they did another very, very tricky experiment where they would take individual people and they would place them in a room with plants, like with other humans who were the so-called Confederates of the experimenters. They were actors, and their job was to pretend everything was normal, even as the room filled up with smoke.
Right.
And so people then responded differently. A lot of people just stayed there and kept writing their quizzes even though no one explicitly told them to. They were just like following the social norms of these people
Yeah.
around them. And some people got up and went out and said, "Hey, just there's something going on here." And interestingly, the experimenters reported that the people who went out to report the problem, they were actually quite calm. But the people who stayed, they were having a terrible time. They were so nervous, they were visibly anxious.
Oh,
And I learned so much from that example. And one of them is, as you said, that like we need to be able to take action, that taking action or that's proportional to the problem that we're facing, that actually makes us feel better. That makes us feel, especially collective action, makes us feel less isolated and it makes us feel more hopeful. But it also reminds me that like we need to act like it's an emergency. And that's one of the things that motivates other people to take action in our society. And that we have, through the mass media, the corporate media, and through social media to some extent, we have all of these people who are kind of acting like those
yeah.
Confederates, like those actors in the experiment, that their job, whether it's, Fox News or even the CBC sometimes, their job is to kind of pretend everything's normal and what are you getting so upset about? And to enforce social pressure that goes along with other kinds of pressure to keep people from taking action.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I've come to learn recently is that it's also just I don't know exactly why, but people aren't talking about climate change with their
Mm,
peers. There's like
mm,
an aversion or a fear of like, oh, what's going to happen? Like, will I lose this friendship? I don't know exactly why, but that
mm,
in itself makes the idea of taking the step of activism very isolating. You know what I mean? It's like, well, my
mhm,
peers, even if like they are, you don't know because you're not asking them. But
mhm,
there's this idea that like, oh, well, even if I turn down like my the temperature in my house and I put on a sweater, like nobody else is going to do it. Right. And I wonder
mhm,
if that's almost been somehow intentional, like kind of
mhm,
curated for us by the way that we experience our lives through social media, through the news, and kind of like everything is normal here. Everybody acts normal.
mhm,
And then you're
mhm,
like, I'm not acting normal. What's wrong with me? But
mhm,
really, that would be the normal. a natural response to a crisis. So I've also really loved this idea of like not pathologizing our stress. Like you're not stressed because there's something wrong with you. You're stressed because there's literally something wrong. Like with that we should be kind of being like, hey, the room is filling with smoke. Something's happening.
Yes, that's exactly true. Yeah, and I think that's so important to recognize that that the problems in our society are not just our personal problems. They're
Mm,
systemic problems that have to do with inequality, like capitalism, but also they're things that can be changed. I think a lot about the work that Martin Seligman does. He's another psychologist, or is another psychologist who studied learned helplessness, which
mhm,
is a condition where, people and also animals, bad things happen to them, and then instead of taking action, they basically collapse or like kind of turn inward in this kind of traumatic way. And he argued that for humans, explanatory style is a big factor in determining whether someone is able to take action in the face of difficult or traumatic things, or whether
mm,
they kind of retreat into themselves.
mhm,
And so he said that if we believe that problems are personal, permanent, and pervasive, then we're
mm,
more likely to feel helpless. So if we believe like, oh, I can't afford rent because like I'm bad at getting a job or something, and it's
right.
always going to be like this and it's like this everywhere, then
Mhm,
we kind of give up and we retreat from taking action.
right.
And so one of the things that movements and that kind of movement ideologies and movement analysis helps us to do is understand, hey, climate change is not actually because I sometimes drive a car. It's actually because of gigantic corporations like fossil fuel companies that have been lying to us for more than half a century about what they knew has been going on all along. And actually, most societies in history are not like this. Most societies are like something else. And deeply kind of embedded structural factors like capitalism or colonialism, they actually can be changed. They don't last forever. And
Mhm,
so I think that understanding to kind of depathologize that stress and also to help people understand the structural issues at work is
mhm,
really key to building movements. The feminist movement in the US, especially in the 1970s, that didn't start necessarily with like women out marching in the streets. It started with these consciousness raising groups where, small groups of women would get together and just talk about their problems, and they would help each other to develop a shared analysis that, hey, the problem isn't just is the problem isn't me, the problem is patriarchy, or the problem is these other kind of systems of power. Um,
mhm,
and I think it's really crucial that we give people opportunities to develop that kind of understanding and analysis. And I think that's another kind of challenge in our movements to building movements that are more intersectional and that can better use a diversity of tactics, is that often people who are more militant don't have patience for that. Maybe they've already gone through that process themselves, right? They already understand the systemic nature of different problems that we face. But it is really critical to make room for these kind of on-ramps or entry pathways for people to develop a deeper understanding of the systemic structural factors in our society that cause climate change and so many other things.
mhm,
I think that's actually really crucial.
mhm. And I think one kind of thing that's really shared that I've been reflecting on is that I think it's actually quite the norm that each person is experiencing their version of intergenerational trauma. And instead of it being like any individual's fault, it's actually unifying to say, like, wait, that actually happened because of a systemic oppressive issue. That was a system problem, not a like me, individual little me problem. And I think when we wake up to that, that's there's an opportunity there to like kind of let go of that individual shame of like I did something wrong. It's like no, like the environment, like the whole air that we're breathing is polluted, you know?
Hmm. Yeah.
Anyways, I could honestly like keep going for so long, but I'm checking the time and we're kind of at the time, sadly. But, good news is that you're coming to Toronto. We're doing the teach-in.
Mhm.
If folks are interested in learning more, we'll be there June 22nd, 23rd. We'll be releasing more information soon. And Aric, if there's one kernel that you want people to take away from this listening, what would it be?
I'm going to cheat and say two, if that's okay.
You're allowed.
So, one of them is that the more I study movements and the more I interview people, the more hopeful I feel. The more I
Hmm.
learn about social movement strategy, the more I feel like we can actually win. And the
Hmm.
more paths I see forward to success and to building a better society. And that's closely related to my second 1.5 points, which is that the groups that have staying power are groups where people are kind to each other and compassionate to
Hmm.
each other. It's not just about having like the right ideas or the right tactics, quote unquote. It's actually about building cultures of resistance that people want to be a part of,
Yeah.
communities that people want to be a part of, and that can support us through struggle and hard times,
Hmm.
because persistence is required to make deep change.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much for joining me. This was such a delight, and I can't wait to see you really soon and have this all in person.
Yeah, I'm really excited too.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
and I
gonna
hope
be
that the
great.
people who are listening will come and join us at the end of June.
Yeah, stay tuned, everybody. We'll catch you next time.
Take
Bye.
care.
Hi everyone, Connor Curtis here, Head of Communications at Sierra Club Canada, just jumping in to do the Q&A for the end. And before I jump into the Q&A, I just want to say a thank you to Aric and to Jessica for that conversation as an activist myself who has been involved lifelong in things, but actually did their history degree in the history, basically, of activism and environmental struggles like the Love Canal chemical disaster. I can say it touched on so many things that I have hoped and wished that we would incorporate more into activism as a broader community. Going to work as an activist, I tend to think of it as it should be like being a carpenter, right? You have a lot of tools in your tool belt, not just a hammer. And there's so many different ways to approach things. So thank you again to Jessica and Aric for something that I found really personally very enlightening. For Q&A this week, as you may be aware, we had a recent event actually in St. John's, Newfoundland, Labrador, which was a carbon tax event, and basically dealing with some of the pricing misinformation and things that have been said about that particular issue that were not correct, and also talking about Bay du Nord and some of the things on that issue, some of the misinformation from corporations that we were seeing. And while I was in the city, somebody asked me kind of generally about how do we deal with the fact that we're all reliant upon these things that we're trying to fight? We're trying to reduce things like oil and gas, right? And my answer was, it's not about where you are, it's about where you want to be. I mean, again, I don't think anybody who was once driving a horse-drawn cart could be called a hypocrite for saying that they thought automobiles would be a good idea, might be a better way to do things, right? And ironically, of course, talking about automobiles, that's something that, uses a lot of fossil fuels. But again, like in the historical context, I don't think you could call anybody a hypocrite for wanting a better way of life using something that would work a bit better in that situation. I don't think you're a hypocrite for being in a traffic jam and thinking, wow, I wish I had public transit to get me from point A to point B. I don't think that would be a hypocritical thing to say at all. Again, we're relying upon a system, and as I think was touched on nicely in this podcast, it's a system change that we need, and focusing too much. There's a nice dovetail here with, again, things in that podcast episode, focusing too much on just the individual impacts and like what individuals do. It kind of denies their ability to actually go out and advocate for something different in a systemic way. So that is one question for this week that came up that I just wanted to address here. I also just want to say that if you're interested in the carbon pricing debate, we have a previous episode called The Carbon Tax Slide that you can check out. We also have 2 episodes specifically to do with Equinor's Bay du Nord and Rosebank oil and gas projects and why those are extremely problematic. And you can check those out also in earlier episodes of the podcast. Please do. And please be sure to send us your questions at info@sierraclub.ca. And nice to be able to respond to a question actually from somebody to me in person. Before we end, just a reminder that if you're feeling stuck and like you would like to take action, and like taking action might help you feel better about the environmental issues that we face, you can do so right now by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. ET. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us.